Okay. Well, it's my pleasure to be here today, and certainly have enjoyed this interaction on these important topics that face our profession. Okay, Karen, apparently I'm not, there we go. Okay. What I want to take just a few minutes today and visit with you about are these topics that you see on the screen now. Comment a bit about how we study rural places, what rural America looks like. I have seen a partial list of those of you that are out there, and I recognize that I have some of my peers that are certainly highly informed about some of these topics, so I look forward to some of your comments as well. Talk just a little bit about agricultural economists and the solid toolkit we have to address these issues, and then touch briefly on the role of teaching, research, and extension in the agricultural economics profession. I'm going to start with a few slides here that just set the stage for domestic rural development in the U.S., and of course these are data looking at population change from 2010 through 2014. The deep dark red counties are counties that have extremely rapid population change, positive growth. The dark blue have negative growth, and so you can see the spatial distribution there. And just as a highlight, you see the rapid growth in population for our friends up in North Dakota in the upper tiers of our country. And then throughout the breadbasket, a lot of population decline in some of our rural counties. This is another slide that in essence supports those trends. These are net migration rates for the same time period, 2010 through 2014. And there you see the rapid in-migration in North Dakota, again, for example, in the western part of the state. You look at my home state, Oklahoma, and you see some population growth occurring on the eastern side, positive migration on the eastern side of the state with net out-migration on the western side of the state. And finally, population density, people per square mile, and you see again the very distinctive geographic patterns that I think most of us are familiar with. A lot of the flyover part of our country, the breadbasket, the midwestern part of our country has very low population density, which has its own unique set of challenges in terms of finding the right economics to provide services, facilities, and infrastructure for those rural residents that do remain in those rural areas. What do we know about how we study rural places? I found a wonderful article by Castle that talked about this study of rural places, and he noted 3 key points, and I think those slides and some slides that follow will emphasize this. First of all, much of rural America has a sparse population, few people per square mile. This is not always the case. Castle did a nice job of noting something that we still talk about, and that's the fact that there are diverse methods to classify rural or non-metro America, and depending upon those classifications you may have a little different type of research, analysis, or actually conclusion. Castle also noted that rural places are interdependent. They do not stand alone, but they have tight linkages to our urban areas and even the global system. Finally, he emphasized the diversity of rural America, the fact that not all rural places are the same. I like this article because Emory talked about rural capital, and he focused on natural capital, man-made capital like infrastructure, human capital, our people, and then social capital. This has continued to this day in some of our discussions. As we study rural places, what lessons have emerged? Well, here are some real quick bullet points that talk about some of the messages that I think that we know and perhaps most of us agree on. Irwin and some of his colleagues had a nice article in our AJAE a few years ago. They noted the rural economy is diverse. They also noted that there are a lot of complex and interdependent relationships between rural areas and urban areas that we need to account for. They made an interesting statement. Migration is driven by amenities and quality of life, and certainly I think that is true in some cases. My friends in North Dakota and myself here in Oklahoma would argue that perhaps oil and gas jobs also drive migration to some sense. They spend a lot of time talking about the idea that sector-based policies are not the solution for many of our rural development problems. So, for example, policies that focus on just the manufacturing sector or policies that focus just on the agricultural sector will not solve all the problems and issues we have in rural America. Finally, great discussion on people versus place. Is it the people in rural America we're concerned about, or do we actually have, in effect, some policy that we want to impact place as well? And they conclude with a good discussion of the very rich toolkit that agricultural economists and regional economists have to address many of these rural problems. So again, a few more quick slides. Thank you to ERS. This is the county typology based on economic type that has been around for a number of years. I know you're all interested in that. I understand that county designation is not necessarily the appropriate designation for some type of research. I still like these maps because when you're talking to someone not familiar with rural America, it allows you to emphasize the fact that not all rural places are the same. And so you see that some rural places, some counties have a high farm dependence, while others have a high mining dependence. Others depend on manufacturing, recreation, or even federal and state government. For the counties that do not have deep dark blue, it doesn't mean there aren't farms and agriculture that are important in those areas. It just means that simply, according to that ERS definition, they did not rise to the category of farm dependent. So again, it emphasizes to all of us that rural America is diverse. I borrowed a couple of slides from my good colleague Brian Whitaker on broadband adoption, something that we've been talking a lot about lately. And this is one slide that Dr. Whitaker shared with me, household broadband adoption based on a criterion of 200 kilobytes per second. And you can see the more you tend toward the deep dark brown or red, the higher the adoption level. The more you tend toward the yellow and the lighter shades, the less the adoption. So we're going to have an issue of a digital divide in some of our rural areas. Then Brian reminded me that, well, maybe that's not a lot of people nowadays are looking at a different criterion, and it's broadband adoption at 3 megabytes. And so here again is the same table, and so again you've got the yellow and the lighter color shades are areas in primarily rural America where you would have broadband adoption, in some cases less than 20%, but certainly less than 40%. So what does this mean, broadband availability and the impact it might have on rural areas? Dr. Whitaker in one of his research projects noted that simply availability of broadband or having the infrastructure out there led to mixed results. Sometimes it might lead to growth and positive development, other times maybe not so much, but adoption was the key. How many individuals, businesses, families were able to actually adopt and utilize that technology. That did indeed lead to higher levels of growth. I think that is a clear indication of the need for programs in our land grant system through extension, for example, to help businesses, families, households not only understand that the technology is out there, but understand how to use it, enhance their human capital. Dr. Whitaker talked a little about download speeds and whether or not that might lead to a greater growth of creative class workers, and like any good researcher that led to another paper. So he had that second paper with his a graduate student in 2016 that looked a little closer at download speeds, and it was quite interesting. One of the conclusions he had was for us to note that the digital highway leads both ways. Putting broadband out in rural areas does have potential for growth, but it also has potential to draw economic activity out of rural areas, and so I find that quite interesting as well. You know, given some of these trends in demographics and some of these issues we have with population density, population growth, and technology like broadband, how do we in fact create wealth in rural areas? Well, Pender and colleagues of his actually spent some time talking about rural wealth creation. I know there's some folks here on the webinar that were involved in this effort, but they made several points about rural wealth creation. It's context dependent. There's no cookie cutter answer, but it depends upon the unique type of capital that is available in that rural area, and sometimes these investments involve risk, and therefore it might be appropriate to have some sort of portfolio approach, diversifying your portfolio in terms of your local economy. They also noted that local ownership tended to be important, and that there were risks and returns associated with that local ownership. One of the points that they made was, and this will come up again, but there is a specific need for strong local capacity in decision making in order for rural wealth creation to occur successfully. A couple of more slides, issues that might be facing us in terms of rural areas in the U.S. Slide identifies deep poverty levels over time from 2010 to 2014. This next slide talks about high natural amenities as defined by the USDA, ERS in their work here. Always fun to look at these types of issues dealing with natural amenities and how, in fact, do they impact rural growth. Do those natural amenities attract the creative class, as we might define creative class? And you can see a little distribution here spatially regarding the creative class across the country. It leads to this conversation about amenities in rural areas. Steve Deller and some of his colleagues took a look at these amenities, and they noted that many rural areas were in fact endowed with natural resources. Some of those amenities might include climate, land, water, winter recreation opportunities, and actual development infrastructure. They discussed the potential to capture and encourage growth in rural areas if indeed these amenities existed. Led me to the thought that perhaps there is a little bit of a discussion left regarding what is a good amenity and what is a poor amenity, and in some level that may be in the eyes of the beholder. So, what is the role of the Land Grant University in terms of teaching, research, and extension? Real quickly, I'm going to talk a little about teaching in general. We have a good set of community and regional economics courses. Deller and colleagues have actually put out on a website the syllabi for a number of community and regional economics courses that are available out there. My colleague Francis Eplin gave a presentation a few years ago, and he brought up an interesting question in terms of our classroom, and all of us may be feeling this pain a little bit, given the public's general disinterest in perhaps investing as much as we have in the past in higher education and in public education. Maybe the question is, have we really done a good job explaining to the public what public goods are and why we should have these public investments? And I thought that was an interesting comment by Dr. Eplin. In terms of research, what are some possible research topics based on those slides I shared? Solutions for rural poverty, persistent poverty, a lot of children in poverty. What are some potential solutions? Globalization, what happens in terms of capital, labor mobility, and information technology as these rural areas compete in a global economy? What is the true capacity for various types of rural areas to create jobs? And then finally, what do we mean by rural development? And I like an interesting definition that I picked up years ago: enhancing the well-being of rural residents wherever they eventually reside. That sort of picks up that people versus place idea. In terms of extension, I think I'm probably running out of time here, Karen, so I'm going to push this along a little bit. But I just see a lot of need, given the challenges that rural areas have and the great needs that those rural areas have, and the consistent theme that pops up regarding local capacity and leadership. I just see a tremendous opportunity for our cooperative extension service colleagues to provide assistance to rural businesses, rural people, rural families, rural leaders, and these are a number of training, technical assistance, and capacity building approaches. Certainly, Stefan Getz and others documented the impact on farms most recently in terms of the Cooperative Extension Service, and so I think Stefan may be on today. My challenge is, can he produce a similar document that might talk about the impact of the Cooperative Extension Service on our rural communities? I think that would be quite interesting. I talked briefly with several of my colleagues here in Oklahoma that work on the ground in rural development, and these are this slide you see now are some of the issues that they brought up, and it was across the state in different and diverse areas. Again, willingness to invest locally, having strong infrastructure, and you know, focusing on local activities seemed to be the theme, and so it reinforced a lot of what I was reading in our literature. Finally, I'll close with a few current thoughts on rural economic development, and these thoughts are based on actually some colleagues' work, Steve Deller, Rebecca Dunsing, and Becca Jablonski, and I have been having a conversation about this Seafair project, but also within our profession, our section, CRENET, Community and Regional Economics Network, that has been around for a number of years, and the synergy that those two organizations have, and both Rebecca and Becca are officers or past officers of the CRENET section, and so we've really enjoyed interacting and having this conversation. And these are some topics in this slide: assessing rural places, some of the same things I've talked with you about today, our resources, water, agriculture, energy, community services, which are man-made resources, and then local capacity, human resources. These seem to us to be some of the key areas that we would look at. I would point out, as we have this conversation and we talk about, you know, agriculture and energy, water, some really important issues, my simple statement would be most of those natural resources and the extraction and use of those natural resources in many cases occurs in these rural areas that we're so greatly worried about, and so they certainly have a relevant place in the conversation. With that, Karen, I would close and certainly be happy to answer any questions. I also have a few additional comments that the group came up with when we had our session in Washington, D.C., and I'll be happy to share those at the appropriate time. Thank you.